The galaxy decided to exile Earth. Humanity didn't wait to be told twice. The earpiece slid again. Mara fixed it with 2 fingers, pressing the device back into the curve of her ear without looking away from the podium. 3rd time in an hour. The technician who fitted it that morning had done it wrong, and she had been too polite to say anything, and now she was sitting in the primary assembly chamber of the galactic accord with 47 species, arranged in concentric rings around the speaking floor, and her ear itched in a way that had no dignified solution. Delegate Sewer of the Vane Collective stood at the podium, tall, blue-skinned, 3 eyes arranged in a slight outward spread, as though designed to see everything at once, without committing to any of it. Sewer had always been courteous to Mara, genuinely warm, even in the particular way that Vane expressed warmth, which looked like attentiveness and felt like being the only person in a room. They had shared a meal once at a trade summit on Kilo Station, and Sewer had laughed at one of Mara's jokes with a real laugh, startled and genuine, the kind that escapes before you have a chance to decide whether it is appropriate. She had thought of Sewer as close to an ally. Sewer was reading the Exile resolution aloud, in English specifically, as a courtesy. The pronunciation was too careful, the emphasis placed exactly right, the pause before the word withdrawal deliberate, and measured all 3 of Sewer's eyes, tracking the document rather than lifting to Mara's face. Someone had coached this. Someone had sat with Sewer and worked through the difficult consonants and the places to breathe, and had decided she should hear this in her own language, in words he not mishear, and whether that was an act of compassion or something colder she could not determine, and she found herself thinking about that instead of listening, which was probably the point. She adjusted her pen. The grounds for this resolution are as follows, Sewer said. First, a systemic pattern of unilateral action contrary to collective accord frameworks. Second, repeated failure to integrate Earth's military capabilities into shared security structures. Third, statistical modeling indicating an unacceptable probability of catastrophic expansion within 6 standard decades. She wrote it down. Her handwriting had been getting smaller since the session opened. It was microscopic now. Statistical modeling. They had run numbers on her species. The numbers had come back wrong. 6 months ago, Earth's chair had been moved. Nobody announced it. She arrived one morning and found it in the 3rd row, slightly off-center, plain wood set among the sculpted seats of the primary circle. She had sat down. She had kept sitting, session after session, taking notes from the 3rd row while the circle discussed trade corridors and border disputes and the formal reclassification of an outer system fungal colony as a protected sentient entity. She had been consulted on some of these matters in private. She had not been consulted at all in the 6 months since the chair moved. That was when she should have understood. She had understood. She had understood the way you understand something you are not yet willing to act on. The chamber was arranged in perfect acoustic rings so that every species present could hear with equal clarity. This was a point of architectural pride. For the Accord, she thought about that. Now, every species hearing the same thing at the same volume, every species hearing this. Sewer opened the vote. It was fast, faster than the vote on whether the fungal colony in the outer quadrant qualified for sapient designation, which had generated 40 minutes of procedural debate and 3 requests for clarification. This vote took 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Mara timed it. 44 in favor, 3 abstentions. She wrote down the 3 abstentions on a separate line. The Kelvash, the Moor, the Telsa. 8 years ago, the Craft incursion. A UN expeditionary unit of 37 soldiers had held a narrow supply corridor that every senior Accord military advisor had formally classified as strategically untenable, not difficult, not risky. Untenable, the assessment recommended full withdrawal and reassignment of resources to a secondary line. The unit held the corridor anyway. 11 days, the Kelvash outer colony survived the Moor supply chain, survived the Telsa evacuation fleet, cleared the zone with 6 hours to spare. 37 soldiers. 3 abstentions. She looked at those 2 numbers for a moment and wrote nothing in the margin. Sewer looked at her. The chamber held the particular silence of a very large space in which every person present is paying careful attention to one thing, not one of 47 species moved. The air handlers hummed at the frequency Mara had long ago memorized without meaning to. The light from the unnamed sun above the skylight was the exact color it always was at this time of day. Delegate Voss, still English still. Carefully rehearsed, humanity has 18 standard months to complete withdrawal from recognized space. All infrastructure, personnel, and registered vessels must be fully withdrawn. The Council appreciates your. The earpiece slid. Mara fixed it. Noted, she said. Her voice came out level. This surprised her in a detached, clinical way. She capped her pen. She placed it parallel to the edge of her notepad. She gathered her papers into a neat stack and stood up from her third-row chair, and she walked across the chamber floor and through the delegate corridor and out into the main concourse without looking back. 47 species watched her walk. She did not look at their faces. She had made a calculation about that. Looking at their faces would give her information she was not ready to process, and she needed her legs to work for approximately 3 more minutes. And looking at faces was a luxury she could not afford. Some of them had looked sorry. She had caught that much in her peripheral vision. She thought the sorry was genuine. She also knew that sorry and a vote were different categories of thing. You could feel one and do the other. Plenty of people had. The concourse was long and pale, lit from above by a sun she had never looked up the name of, which was a habit she had developed here, leaving small things unnamed so that leaving them would cost less. She walked the full length of it and stopped at the far end and took out her comm unit. Opened the message, Earth Command Tier 1 Joint Chiefs, full distribution. She typed 2 words. She looked at them. She sent them. Pack everything. She put the comm in her pocket and stood into the corridor under the unnamed sun and pressed the earpiece firmly into the curve of her ear one last time. It stayed. That was the best thing that had happened to her all day. Humanity, it turned out, was extraordinarily good at leaving. Nobody had anticipated this. The Accord Monitoring Committee had projected 18 months minimum, probably extended to 22. They had factored in bureaucratic friction, emotional resistance from long-term residents, legal disputes over infrastructure, ownership, the sheer logistical weight of extracting a species from 43 worlds. Simultaneously, they had drafted contingency language. For delays, they had assigned observers to the 12 most complex sites. They had written their timelines with what they considered generous buffers. Humanity had its personnel off 43 worlds. In 11 months, the observers filed reports. The early ones used the word efficient. The later ones used unusually efficient, and then the word concerning appeared in a footnote and then in a subheading and then in the subject line of the third formal inquiry. The monitoring committee sent. Mara answered each inquiry the same way, proceeding as scheduled. Her title was Director of Withdrawal Operations. She had accepted the title without comment because it was accurate, and she did not have the energy for anything else. 40 staff, 700 field coordinators across every departure site, a communications backlog that never dropped below 300 open items. The office she worked from was a converted meeting room on a transport ship that spent more time docked at various withdrawal sites than it did in transit. And she drank bad coffee because the good coffee came from a supplier in more controlled export territory, and the export permits had been suspended since the vote, and she was not going to ask for an exception. She reviewed every departure manifest personally, every ship, every station, every outpost. She needed there to be complete and final number, a number she had verified herself start to finish. The number was the thing she could control when everything else had stopped being something she had any say in. The research teams were extraordinary. She had prepared materials for difficult conversations, talking points about professionalism during transition, about leaving facilities in good condition, about the importance of orderly process, even in circumstances that felt anything but orderly. She did not need a single page of it. They packed everything, every hard drive, every sample archive, every atmospheric measurement and star map and mineral survey and soil core, going back 4 decades of operations. The xenobiology team on Moore Station filled 6 additional cargo containers beyond their authorized weight limit, with specimens classified as personal research materials under a regulation that technically permitted it if the materials had been collected during approved research programs. She read the regulation. She approved the cargo containers. The climatology team on Vane Prime brought back data they had technically not been authorized to collect, presented in precisely labeled drives, with documentation that would have satisfied a review board on its most rigorous day. 3 graduate students who had been on an academic exchange program at the Vane Institute came home with 11 terabytes of geological and spatial data covering everything within sensor range of their student dormitory. Their official fellowship scope had been cultural observation. They had innocent expressions, the specific innocent expressions of people who are fully aware of what they have done and have correctly calculated that no one is going to make an issue of it. She wrote them commendation letters and filed them in an archive folder she titled Administrative Review Non-Urgent. And she moved on. The withdrawals that took longest were not the military installations or the research stations. They were the schools, 14 of them across 11 worlds. The kinds of schools that appear wherever people go when they plan to stay small, underfunded, running on goodwill, and the organizational energy of a handful of teachers who cared more about the work than about the conditions. The teachers were the last ones to sign the departure forms at every single site. They packed their classrooms like they were packing something irreplaceable, because they were. Every drawing off every wall, every book, every small trophy from every science fair, and every spelling competition, and every inter-school athletics event that had happened on an alien world where nobody had expected human children to be playing sports. She approved 2 extra cargo allowances without requesting committee review. She did 12 embassy closures herself, not required. A certified sub-coordinator could handle the paperwork and seal the doors. She did them anyway. She stood in empty rooms that had been full of work and noise and the daily texture of human presence for over a decade, and she walked every corridor and signed every form and told herself she was doing a thorough inventory check, which was true, and that the inventory check was the only thing happening, which was considerably less true. On Kelvesh Prime, the local diplomatic community held a farewell reception. It was in the Grand Civic Hall, which was the venue they used for the things they wanted remembered, banners along the walls, music from Earth, which meant someone had done real research, had gone looking through archives to find something she would recognize rather than something that simply sounded human. The Kelvash ambassador gave a speech about partnerships and futures and the lasting value of the relationships built across 12 years of shared civic life. And his delivery was sincere, and she believed every word he said, and she stood in the front row and listened to all of it. There was a cake, large and beautiful, Earth's flag, rendered in blue and white frosting, the continents accurately placed, the proportions right, the kind of detail that does not happen by accident. Underneath the globe, in careful raised lettering, safe travels humanity. Mara stood in front of it. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen floor, specifically the linoleum worn through near the sink where 50 years of foot traffic had taken the pattern down to bare material, a small upturned crack in the far corner that caught your toe if you forgot it was there. She had not thought about that floor in years. She had no explanation for why she was thinking about it now, standing in a grand hall on an alien world under banners printed in her honor, looking snorts at a cake that represented the genuine kindness of people who had voted to remove her species from their community and were now very sorry about the way it felt. She stood there until she felt steady. She ate a slice. She complimented the baker through the ambassador's interpreter. She worked the entire room, shook every hand in the Kelvash way, 3 fingertips to 3 fingertips, a gesture she had learned in her first month on Prime and had not forgotten. And she was present for every handshake. She meant every single one. The last ship was hers. She was the final official human presence in recognized space, which was a logistical requirement and not a symbolic statement. The director of withdrawal operations was required to certify completion in person and be last to depart. She had written that requirement herself 3 weeks into the role when establishing the closure protocols, not knowing she would be the one standing alone in an empty embassy building at 11:00 in the morning with a coffee preference list in her jacket pocket. She had found the list taped inside a kitchen cabinet, someone's order from 3 years ago, the handwriting she did not recognize, a small practical record of a working day that no longer existed. She had peeled it off the cabinet without thinking and put it in her pocket and had not managed to throw it away. She walked the Earth Embassy from top to bottom, main hall, conference rooms, the 4th floor garden space where some previous staff member had spent years growing plants from earth in light-adjusted planters that were now removed and catalogued, the planters left clean and bare in the unused room. She stood in the main hall and looked at the walls and thought about everything that had happened in them. She turned off the lights. She found the wall panel and pressed the switch. The hall went dark. She walked to the front door in the dark because she knew exactly where the door was and she did not need light to leave a place. She had spent 12 years walking. The door sealed behind her with a sound, like a question nobody had thought to ask yet. On the transport back to the ship, she opened a new file on her comm unit, not official, personal, just a list, a running account of things started with no clear plan and no intended audience. She titled it "What We Found Anyway." She left the first page blank. She watched Accord Central Station shrink to a point of light through the viewport and then to less than that, until there was nothing to see. 18 months, the resolution had said. 14 months clean, complete. Every form signed, every manifest verified, every light turned off. The monitoring committee sent a final official communication. Withdrawal confirmed, compliance verified. The Galactic Accord thanks humanity for its cooperation during this process. She did not respond to that one. The uncharted reach was not empty. That was the first thing, the foundational thing, the thing that the Accord surveys had failed to determine because they had mapped to the edges of what interested them and stopped the way you stop at the top of a staircase and assume you know what is at the bottom without walking down to check. Humanity walked down to check. The first wave of settlers arrived 3 months after the last human left. Recognized space. Mara staged the initial operations from a station the size of a research module that she had personally anchored to a stable asteroid in what the Accord's navigational charts labeled Dead Corridor 7. The label came from a survey conducted 40 years ago with sensor equipment that her chief scientist, a compact and methodical man named Owen, described with characteristic restraint as historically significant. Dead Corridor 7 had 17 navigable transit lanes, 4 stable planetary systems, and a moon orbiting the largest gas giant with liquid water and oxygen, nitrogen, atmosphere, and soil composition that Owen, after running his 3rd round of confirmation tests, described as almost insultingly hospitable. "It looks like someone designed it for us," he said, studying the atmospheric output. "Nobody designed it," Myra said. "We just looked." He printed the readout and pinned it to the wall of his office, which was a repurposed cargo module bolted to the side of the station. It was the first thing pinned to a wall in the Reach. She noticed that without meaning to. The way the first thing on a wall is different from everything that comes after. The early settlements were hard. She did not lie to herself about this. Not then, not in the years that followed the first winter on New Meridian, most hospitable of the early Cites Owen's atmospheric paradise. Killed 43 people. Equipment failures. That the pre-settlement surveys had not anticipated. A storm system with a pattern unlike anything in the models. Atmospheric pressure variations that sat just outside the range that the pre-departure equipment had been calibrated to detect. 43 people. She knew every name. She wrote every letter herself, sitting at the folding desk in her module with the station's air handlers running too loud, writing sentences that had no good version. The second winter killed 7. By the third year, New had 11,000 residents, 2 schools, a medical center, a community hall that had been built by volunteer labor over 6 weekends, and a communications relay strong enough to reach the outer edge of current reach. Operations. The 43 dead were buried on a hill above the main settlement with a view of 3 moons and the settlement's central boulevard had been named for Cal Rowe, a teacher who had been one of the 43 and whose former students had organized the naming campaign with the specific, unshakable determination of children who have decided something is important and will not be talked out of it. Mara attended the naming ceremony over a long-distance relay, watching the street sign go up on her secondary screen while Owen ran atmospheric data on a new site. In the same window, entry 41, New Meridian Central Avenue, formerly unnamed, named for Cal Rowe. Population 11,000, still growing. The file had become a habit. Every new thing, every discovery, every station, commissioned and lane mapped an element. Cataloged, she needed there to be a number. The number kept growing and she kept adding to it because the act of recording what they were building had become as necessary to her as the building itself. By the 5th year, the Reach had 17 established colonies, 3 research stations, a communications grid covering 90% of known Reach space, and a mining operation on a dead moon in the far corridor that had found something in the bedrock that matched no existing mineral classification in any scientific database humanity had access to. Owen ran tests for 6 weeks, methodical and thorough, and then came to Mara's office, a real office now with 4 walls and a door that closed properly, and a window that looked out at a star. She had named herself and set a sample on her desk. Gray, slightly warm to the touch. In direct light, it caught the spectrum, a way that made your eyes do something they did not usually do. It is not in the periodic table, Owen said. Put it in, Mara said. They named the element after one of the New Meridian 43. They filed it under entry 78 and moved on because the Reach kept opening in front of them, no matter how far they went, and there was always more work ahead than behind. The Dravani contact came in the 6th year. Pulsar Zone 7 appeared on every Accord navigational chart with a single annotation printed in the standard warning format: impenetrable high radiation output, unstable pulse intervals, no viable transit path, no further survey recommended. The Accord had detected a stable planetary system at the zone center 30 years ago, noted the impossibility of reaching it with then current technology, and reallocated those survey resources elsewhere. Mara's navigation lead, Petra, had been looking at the zone's pulse interval data for 4 months. She came to the office with printed charts and the specific expression of someone who has identified a solution that will require More work than anyone currently has time for. The pulses are not random, she said. There are windows. They are small, but they repeat on a predictable cycle. How small? 4 minutes 40 seconds. Owen looked at the charts for approximately 90 seconds and said that was probably enough if the shielding were modified correctly and the entry angle were precise. Probably was not confirmed, Myra noted. This. Let's find out, she said. The transit corridor through Pulsar Zone 7 took 8 months to build, 3 teams working in rotation because the radiation prevented extended shifts. The pulse timing required precise coordination for every single material run. On the 42nd day of construction, a cargo drone clipped the edge of an unstable pulse boundary and was destroyed, which was a loss and also excellent data on the exact location of the boundary, which improved their mapping by a factor that Owen wrote up in a brief report that Mara read twice. He kept a photograph of the destroyed drone on his wall next to the atmospheric readout from the first day. In the Reach, the first crew transit happened on an unremarkable Tuesday. Mara had not chosen Tuesday for any particular reason. It was simply the day the corridor was certified and the crew was ready. 4 minutes 38 seconds. On the other side, a system with 4 planets on the third planet at a distance of 6,000 km, the sensors picked up organized light patterns on the night side. City lights. She sat in the observation module of the transit vessel and looked at those lights and thought about the coffee preference list still in her jacket pocket, which she had been transferring from jacket to jacket for 6 years. Without quite being able to stop, she thought about the monitoring committee's final message, compliance verified. Thank you for your cooperation, she thought about the 4-minute vote and the 3 abstentions and the unnamed son. Then she closed the file she had been keeping, put it away, and went to work. First contact with the Drevani took 3 months. They were not easy months. The Drevani were cautious and territorial, highly capable in certain areas of physics and material science, and operating under a political structure that Mara's interpreter, Dan, a young man whose ability to recognize patterns in unfamiliar communication systems was the most useful skill she had encountered in the Reach, needed 3 weeks to begin to map. They were also entirely aware that they were trapped. They had observed the pulsar zone for generations. They had built theoretical models about what lay beyond it. They had launched unmanned probes to the boundary and watched them fail. They had generations of scientists who had worked on the problem and passed their work to the next generation like a debt that could not be paid. They had no expectation that anyone from outside would come through. Then on a Tuesday, a human ship appeared in their sky. The first speaker of the Drevani was an older woman. Myra could not produce her full name correctly. The name required a consonant cluster that Dan explained was simply outside what human vocal anatomy could reliably generate. The first speaker found this genuinely amusing and demonstrated the correct pronunciation 3 times with attentive, patient interest each time. Mara attempted it. They met in a neutral facility in the upper atmosphere of the third planet, agreed upon because it was neutral ground for both parties, a concept the first speaker understood immediately and without explanation, which told Mara Something about what kind of people they were. The first speaker asked methodical questions, good ones, about the corridor. Construction, about the communities. The reach, about how many humans existed. And where they had come from, she asked. How long the construction had taken, she asked what the failure rate had been. Then she asked, who sent you? Mara thought about the chamber, the earpiece, the 4-minute vote. Nobody sent us, she said. We were in the neighborhood. Dan translated. A pause. The first speaker looked at Mara with the expression of someone deciding how much of an answer is the whole answer. She said something brief and precise. Dan translated. She says that is either very lucky or very typical of you. Probably both, Mara said. The first speaker said something else. Dan translated. She wants to discuss FTL theoretical frameworks. Her team has been developing a working model for 60 years and she would like to compare it with your practical data. Mara opened her file. Entry 315. Pulsar Zone 7, First Contact Drevari. Civilization, population approximately 4 billion, pre-FTL 60 years of active. Theoretical development awaiting. Practical review, notes, good coffee. Pronunciation of first speaker's name. Remains unresolved. She was on volume 3. She bought volume 4. The message arrived on a Wednesday, 7 years after the vote. Not through any official channel. There were no official channels. Humanity was not part of the accord, had shared no common communications infrastructure with recognized space since the withdrawal, had no diplomatic presence, no registered frequencies, no exchange agreements. Whatever routing this message had used was not in any directory Mara currently held access to. It had been built on a human communications protocol deprecated in 2091. She sat with that for a long moment. Someone had researched that, had gone back through decades of Earth communications history looking for a pathway that would reach Mara directly, privately, and only Mara. That kind of research takes time and specific intent. This message had been prepared the day it was sent, had been anticipated, planned for, perhaps dreaded. She was 3 weeks into the reach. Infrastructure authorities quarterly. Budget review, 17 spreadsheets open. Across 2 screens, she closed every one and read the message. No greeting, no apology, no acknowledgement of the 7 years or what had caused them. Just data. Harath expansion vectors updated to the current month, fleet disposition across 12 systems, casualty figures by species, by sector, by year. The numbers laid out without editorial commentary, without softening language, presented with the flat precision of someone who understood that Mara would read numbers correctly and would not need them explained to her. She read them correctly. She sat in her office, real walls, a real door, a window looking out at a star she had named herself, and she read the data and did not move for a while. The Harath had been a known threat for 60 years, not a species in the way the word is normally used, a front and expanding system of automated machinery and engineered organisms that consumed available resources and continued consuming, that had adapted to every containment measure applied to it over 6 decades of engagement, that did not negotiate and did not pause and did not make the errors that come from pride or fear or the desire to be remembered. Well, Every strategic assessment of the Harath that Mara had ever read said the same thing in different language. Controllable with coordinated response. Dangerous without it. The Accord had been working on coordinated response for 60 years. In the 7 years since humanity's exile, the Harath front had consumed 9 systems. 3 species had stopped transmitting. The Accord's combined military had been in continuous active engagement for 4 years and was, according to Sewers' data, projected to hold the current defensive line for approximately 1 more year before it failed. After that, the projections offered 2 branches. The better branch had the front stabilizing at the inner corridor boundary for roughly 3 years before resuming advance. The worst branch did not have a stopping point. She looked at the reach map on her third screen. 31 colonies now, expanded from the original 17, 3 research stations, the communications grid, the mining operations, the transit corridors, the roads built through lanes the Accord had labeled dead. The Dravani, 10 years from FTL capability, according to the first speaker's last estimate. The Harath front, on the worst projected vector at current expansion rate, would reach the outer reach boundary in 14 years. She called a full council session. It lasted 6 hours, and it was the hardest meeting she had ever run. She had expected the argument against intervention. She had not expected how right it would feel to sit inside it. Neil, who commanded the Reach Defense fleet, laid out the case without performance and without anger. He had lost his brother in the final year of recognized space operations, a fact he mentioned once to establish why his position was not coming from ignorance, and then did not mention again. The Accord, Neil said, had made a deliberate political calculation that humanity was more dangerous than beneficial, that the risks of keeping humanity in recognized space outweigh the advantages, and that exile was the correct management of that calculation. If humanity intervened in the Harath campaign now, that calculation would never be properly examined. The Accord would record that they had pushed humanity out, and humanity had come back when needed, which would establish permanently that pushing humanity out was a viable and consequence-free strategy. They would do it again. Neil was not wrong. Mara let every voice in the room finish. She took 3 pages of notes in the small handwriting she had developed in the primary assembly chamber and had never unlearned. Then she said, 14 years, the Harath front reaches our outer boundary in 14 years. The Dravani are 10 years from FTL. She did not say the rest of it out loud, that they had flown through Pulsar corridor to find those 4 billion people, that they had shown up in their sky on a Tuesday and been treated with the kind of trust that is only possible from people who have been waiting a very long time and have decided to believe that waiting was worth it. She thought the room could get there without being led. Neil ran the math. We're not going back for the Accord, she said. We are going because if we don't, we fight the Harath alone in our own corridors in 14 years, without allies, without support, with 4 billion people behind us who trusted us when we told them we were just in the neighborhood. We go because it is the logical thing. We come back when it is done. She paused. We do not go back to be welcomed. We do not go back to negotiate terms. We go because the geometry of the situation requires it, and because we are people who understand geometry. The vote passed, not unanimously. She recorded every dissenting name, not with contempt, for the record, because a decision made against real and reasonable opposition is a different weight than one made in an empty room, and the difference deserved to be properly documented. She wrote Souter's response alone at her desk late, with the reach map open on the screen beside her. She knew exactly what she wanted to say. She had been composing this message in her head for 7 years in versions she had no intention of sending. The version about the chair being moved 3 rows back without announcement. The version about 4 minutes being shorter than a fungal classification. Vote the version about the rehearsed English and the cake with the careful continents. Every version of that message she had written in her head and discarded, because she was a professional and because sending it would feel good for approximately 45 seconds and then feel like something else entirely. She wrote 11 words. We'll need transit corridors through sectors 7 and 12, clear them. No welcome, no terms, no ceremony, just logistics, just move so we can work. She sent it and closed the file. The fleet preparation took 4 months, which was fast. It was fast because Owen and his team had spent 7 years building ships for the specific conditions of unmapped deep space, heavier hulls, better radiation shielding systems, designed for extended operation without the resupply access that settled space vessels took for granted. They had been built for exploration. They had been built for the reach. They had also, Owen mentioned with the unassuming expression of a man who had been thinking about a specific scenario for longer than he had ever discussed, weapon systems of a type and scale that the Accord's monitoring committee had not been aware of when they sent their 3 formal inquiries about whether the withdrawal was proceeding correctly. When did you add those? Mara asked. 3rd year, Owen said. After the first New Meridian winter, I started thinking about preparation in a broader sense. The 2nd winter we lost 7. The 3rd winter we lost 0. The pattern interested me. She thought about 11 terabytes. She thought about innocent expressions. Good enough for government work, she said. I prefer thorough, Owen said. 140 ships, not the largest fleet by count. By tonnage, shielding, and operational range, it was the most capable collection of human military hardware assembled since the border crises, the event that had produced 37 soldiers, a corridor held for 11 days, 3 abstentions and no acknowledgement. There were people in the Accord who did not know these vessels existed. The monitoring committee had submitted 3 formal inquiries about whether the withdrawal was proceeding correctly, had received proceeding as scheduled, and had apparently not considered what humanity might have been building in the years that followed. Sewer's response to Mara's 11 words arrived the morning the fleet staged for departure. Corridor 7 and 12 cleared. Accord forces holding the Lorth engagement line. Pending arrival. No terms attached. No, we were wrong. No, we are grateful. No, please hurry. Just the path is open. Myra read it twice. She put the comm unit in her jacket pocket beside the coffee preference list she had been carrying for 7 years, and she went to the bridge. Petra was at the navigation station, running corridor transit checks with the concentrated focus of someone who had spent 4 minutes and 38 seconds inside a pulsar zone and had no intention of being imprecise about timing ever again. Dan sat at the communications array, updating translation matrices for Accord. Species, files he had kept fully current for 7 years against the possibility nobody had been able to say out loud. Myra stood at the forward viewport. The Reach was behind her, 31 colonies. Cal Rose Street, 8 volumes of the file. The Giovanni first speaker with her. 3 demonstrations of an unpronounceable name and 60 years of FTL. Theory that was getting closer to practical every month. In front of her, everything else. All ships confirmed ready, Petra said. Transit in 4 minutes, Myra said. She did not say anything after that. The fleet moved. The first thing the Kelvash forward command said when the fleet dropped out of FTL at the Lorith engagement line came through on open channel, unencrypted in the voice of someone who had not prepared for this exact moment. How many ships is that? The voice was young, her translator flagged the speaker as a junior rank. Half a second before the protocol identification confirmed it, she found out later his name was Cole. He had been a junior operations officer 2 months ago before a Harith strike on a relay station took out his immediate commanding officers and 2 of the 3 officers above them in the Kelvash fleet did what it had to do, which was move the next available person into the open seat. 140, Mara said, form your remaining vessels on our left flank, send me a full status report on the Harith front. Last 30 standard days. A pause. Delegate Voss. She had not been called delegate anything in 7 years. Director Voss, she said, or just Voss, the status report, please. The report was worse than Sewer's data, and better than the worst projections. The Harith front had advanced 4 systems further than the estimates in Sewer's message. The inner defensive line had collapsed at 2 anchor points held at 3 others through the kind of effort that chews through personnel and equipment at a rate that cannot be sustained. The combined Kelvash and more fleets were operating at 58% of certified capacity. The Tals had pulled 2 of their 3 fleet groups back toward their home systems. Mara, Owen, Petra, and Dan reviewed the report at the tactical display on the bridge, standing because nobody had thought to bring chairs to the forward station, and nobody thought it was the right moment to say anything about it. 9 months to push the front back to a stable perimeter, Owen said. 11, Mara said, if we do it correctly. He looked at her. We do it correctly, she said. She was right about 11 months. She was also right that there was nothing simple or clean about any of it. The Harith were not a fleet, they were a process, an expanding system that consumed available resources and continued consuming, that had adapted to every countermeasure applied to it over 60 years of engagement, that did not overextend or make decisions based on pride or commit to strategy before it had been tested. Fighting them was not a battle in the way that word implies, clean lines and decisive moments. It was maintenance, continuous, precise, grinding maintenance of a defensive position while simultaneously locating and destroying the production nodes that fed the front, and every destroyed node was replaced in time, and the work never stopped requiring full attention. People died. She did not dress this in language that made it smaller. Cole, the young Kelvash officer who had Asked how many ships became someone she worked alongside closely for 5 months. He was good at his work in the way young officers become good when circumstances remove all the alternatives. Precise, fast with information, honest about uncertainty in a way that Mara valued more than any other quality in a briefing. In the 6th month, a Harith automated strike destroyed the relay station he was coordinating from. She put his name in the file. The more fleet admiral, a being whose name translated at Dan's best attempt as something like the one who organizes the forward direction, lost 2 of his 3 flagships in the 3rd month and continued operating the campaign from the remaining vessel with no observable pause in function. She asked him once how he managed it. He said something that Dan translated as, "There is still a direction and I am still the one organizing it." She put that in the file too. The Telsaw, who had pulled 2 fleet groups back to protect their home systems at the start of the campaign, returned in the 7th month when the advancing front threatened their outer boundary. They came back without being asked, without negotiation, without preconditions, without a communication to Mara requesting acknowledgement or positioning. They simply appeared at the line and reported in. Entry 4012. Telsia 2 fleet returned to Lorth Line. Unprompted, month 7. 3 Dravani volunteers were present. For the last 4 months of the campaign, this had not been planned and had absolutely happened anyway. The Dravani were not FTL capable. They did not have warships or military training or any practical experience with the kind of operation they were inserting themselves into. They had sent 3 engineers who had been working on energy field propagation problems for their FTL program and who had, upon hearing a detailed briefing about the specific production node problem that none of the Accords military engineers had yet solved, announced that they had relevant data and that they would be coming along. The relevant data was relevant. The problem got solved. The solution shortened the campaign's final phase by approximately 6 weeks. One of the 3 was Lena. Mara could now pronounce her full name correctly. The first speaker had expressed, through written communication, something between surprise and satisfaction when informed of this. In the 9th month, in a briefing room on the Accord command station, a Kelvash admiral named in his language something that translated roughly as carries the line asked Mara a direct question. He had taken Cole's position 4 months ago and had performed it with the same flat competence that Mara had come to associate with people who are handed responsibilities too heavy too fast and decide that performing badly is not an option. Director Voss, he said, in the room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when the thing everyone has been thinking about is finally being said. I need to ask you plainly, what does humanity want from this? Mara said nothing. Readmission to the Accord territory. Rights, reparations for the withdrawal. Period. We can have those conversations. We should have those conversations, but I need to understand what you came here for before those conversations become possible. She looked at him. She thought about the chamber, the plane, wood chair in the 3rd row, the earpiece sliding down, the careful English pronunciation of the word withdrawal rehearsed until it landed cleanly. She thought about New Meridian in winter, 43 names, Owens atmospheric readout pinned to a wall, Cal Rose Street in new metal. She thought about city lights visible from 6,000 km on a world the Accord had. Surveyed to the boundary and stopped. She opened her file, Volume 8. Current. She flipped to a blank page near the back. She wrote one word at the top of it in her small handwriting. She tore the page out carefully, folded it once and placed it face down on the briefing table. She slid it across to him. He picked it up, he read it, he looked at her. Nothing. We don't want back in, she said. We built something better than what we had. While you were deciding we weren't worth the cost, the reach belongs to us. Corridors we mapped belong to us. Things that every chart in the station labeled as dead or unreachable or not worth the survey, we found them and they are ours. She paused. You can visit when this is over if you conduct yourselves appropriately. He looked at the page for a moment. Then he looked at her. Then why come at all? He said. It was not a challenge, it was a real question. From someone who genuinely did not yet have the answer and wanted it. She thought about Lena correcting her pronunciation with patient, bright attention every time she got it wrong. She thought about the first speaker in 60 years of FTL theory passed from one generation to the next on a world surrounded by a barrier that nobody outside had ever tried to cross. She thought about 4 billion people in 14 years and what it means to have made a promise in a doorway, even if you never said it out loud. Because if you fell, she said, the Harith would reach us in 14 years. We would fight them alone without allies, with our backs to everything we built. She looked at him without blinking. We came for practical reasons, that is all. Do not make it into something that it is not. He nodded. He folded the page and put it in the front pocket of his uniform jacket. And if the Accord asked you to return, he said quietly, formally as members. She held out her hand. He looked at it. The page, she said. He took it out and gave it back. She put it in her file, the file that had started with a blank first page 7 years ago and was now on its 8th volume. Ask us in 20 years, she said, when we see whether you have learned something. The campaign ended in the 11th month. Not with a single fleet action, not with a speech or a ceremony or a moment. Visible from a distance, the last production node was confirmed destroyed. On a morning when Mara was reviewing transit data for the return route home, and Owen came to the doorway of her office and said the number, and she wrote it in the file, and that was that. The defensive line stabilized. The Harith front receded to a perimeter that the Accord's combined fleet could hold, without requiring the kind of effort that could not be sustained. It was not victory in the way people write poetry about victory. It was the end of an emergency. She was on the bridge of the flagship when the final confirmation came in. Owen was at his station. Petra was at navigation, already running the transit calculations for the route home with the focused efficiency of someone who has been ready for this specific calculation for 3 weeks. Dan was reading a message from the Dravani FTL team who had apparently sent 19 follow-up questions during the campaign and had saved them all to send together the moment the operational hold on non-essential communications was lifted. Mara stood at the forward viewport. Recognized space was behind her. 12 years of working life. The Kelvash who had made a careful cake, Sewer who had rehearsed the English, the monitoring committee's final message, compliance, Verified thank you for your cooperation, the one she had not answered. Cole, whose name was in the file, the admiral who had asked what humanity wanted and had accepted the answer. The Reach was ahead. 31 colonies, Cal Rose Street. Element on Volume 8 that had no Accord designation, 4 billion people 10 years from FTL, which Lena now said was more like 8 volumes of what humanity had found when they went looking at things everyone else had called dead. She opened the file. Volume 8, current entry. She did not write what the entry was. For she did not need to. The file had been keeping its own account since the first blank page. All ships positioned for transit. Petra said. Take us home, Myra said. The fleet turned. She kept writing as the transit corridor opened and the stars shifted and the Reach spread out in front of them, every corridor mapped in every light found, and every entry numbered in the file she had been keeping since the door sealed behind her with a sound like a question. The galaxy had exiled them because they could not stop finding things. They had found things anyway. Neither, it turned out, could they stop.